Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this Achates live session on Thursday, the 14th of July. Today, we're going to be exploring how to maximise your fundraising with limited resources. And our discussion today is going to be chaired by our Director of Development, Deborah Larwood, who I'll be handing over to in just a short while. So to introduce myself, my name is Alex Mayer, and I'm a Senior Consultant here at Achates. We're a creative consultancy with a holistic approach to recruitment, fundraising and strategy development. We take our name from Greek and Roman mythology. Achates was the close friend and loyal advisor to Aeneas. So we think our name quite neatly describes the relationship that we offer to our clients within the cultural sector. We set up Achates Live to support the sector, bringing fundraisers and other arts professionals together in order to discuss key topics and also to enable you to help and support one another. Whilst we acknowledge that Achates doesn't necessarily have all of the answers, what we absolutely do have is an overview of the cultural sector. And we're incredibly passionate about using this perspective and role in a supportive way. These live streams began as a way for us to support the sector during the first lockdown, and they've continued on a regular basis since then, driven by topics that you, our viewers, have requested. Today's session, as I mentioned, will be focused on key considerations and strategies for maximising your fundraising success, whatever your resources, how to retain your contributed income through efficient stewardship, and how donor relationship management might evolve in the future. So just a brief bit of housekeeping before we begin to say that all of the information shared in today's conversation is of course live and correct at the time of broadcast. So now I am delighted to be able to welcome our panel for today, who will be exploring this topic with us. So firstly, Tom Shalaka. Hello, Tom.
Hiya.
Hiya. He's fundraising and ticket sales manager at Lighthouse Pool. After completing a fundraising traineeship at Sheffield Theatres, Tom joined the development team at Northern Ballet in the role of development officer corporates. Following this, he moved to Cambridge, where he worked in alumni relations at the University of Cambridge, before going on to manage the fundraising and sponsorship programme at Cambridge Live. In 2018, Tom moved to Lighthouse Pool to take on the role of fundraising manager and start up a fundraising programme from scratch. Since January this year, he's also taken over the role of ticket sales manager on an interim basis, so a busy time for Tom. Alongside his work at Lighthouse, Tom is also a trustee of English Folk Expo. Moving on now to our second panellist, Lynn Farnell, Director of Development at London Chamber Orchestra. Hi, Lynn. Are you there?
I am here, but muted. Hello, everyone.
Hello. Nice to see you. Lynn has spent over 20 years specialising in fundraising for the cultural sector, initially as a development manager for leading theatres in the Northwest, then as a fundraising consultant working with a range of arts and education charities, developing fundraising strategies, supporting major capital appeals, bid writing and recruiting, building and mentoring teams. More recently, Lynn has balanced consultancy work with a role as Deputy Director of Development at the Royal Northern College of Music, with a focus on developing new individual giving revenue streams. In November 2021, Lynn became Director of Development for London Chamber Orchestra, attracted by a new challenge to join a small, dynamic team relaunching a historic orchestra. And our third panellist for today is Una Murphy, who is Interim Director of the Cultural Philanthropy Foundation. Hello, Una.
Hi, Alex. Hi, everyone.
Hello, nice to see you. She has over a decade of experience leading transformative projects that sit at the intersection of art and social justice. She's produced and directed change-making creative projects with asylum seekers, care-leaving young people, former sex workers, and individuals who have experience of the criminal justice system. In 2015, Una co-founded Change of Address, a 3-year initiative to integrate refugee artists into the Irish creative industries, for which she won the inaugural Joe Cox Award for Young Female Changemaker. She recently received a first-class honours diploma in coaching from the University of Cambridge, with a research focus on the dynamic between individual and community in bringing about systemic change. And as I mentioned today, the session will be chaired by our Director of Development, Deborah Larwood, who will set the scene for us shortly and then lead today's discussion with the panel. I'll then be back to join you at the end with some questions from the audience. So please do send those over in the chat as we go along. And our General Manager, Victoria, will ensure that these are picked up and then fed over to me. So for now, I shall pass things back over to you, Deborah.
Thank you very much, Alex, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really looking forward to getting into a discussion with our brilliant panel today. But before we do, a few words on our topic. Now, whilst fundraising is an incredibly rewarding profession and by its very nature creates a construct through which many stakeholders can coalesce around a shared set of values and collectively help to drive meaningful benefit for others, there is no getting away from the reality that fundraising in the cultural sector, and let's face it, fundraising full stop, is a complex area of work. During my own career as an arts fundraiser, I've seen and heard many an organisation who have set their fundraising targets on the basis of the gap to close to make the budget balance. At the same time, even if targets have indeed been set using a data-led or evidence-based approach, the landscape is incredibly competitive. Whatever the circumstances, whatever the context, fundraising targets can be challenging. For those of you who have read the new and recently published Arts Council Private Investment in Culture survey, you'll have seen that organisations have been successful in attracting private investment, often by relying on securing that support through leveraging their existing networks or building new networks of private philanthropists. And this has been done by and large through active engagement of stakeholders, including boards. And over the pandemic in particular, organisations have reported that their tactics include employing effective organisational and data management systems and tools to improve institutional intelligence in order to support that nuanced and targeted fundraising activity. Perhaps one of the more interesting trends we've seen as well is the move towards embedding operational efficiencies and trying to maximise stewardship work by, for example, overlaying cultivation of current and prospective supporters. Here at Achates, we take an audience-informed approach to our work, and we advocate that the strongest case for support needs to be rooted in a clear articulation of the value that art and culture is driving and for whom. Understanding this and uniting these principles together with prospective supporters of your work can help to maximise your success in fundraising. We also, of course, know that fundraising is a team sport and should never become the responsibility of one person or indeed one department. Can building a culture of philanthropy amongst our colleagues and boards enable us to build a culture of philanthropy amongst our audiences, our visitors and our participants more efficiently? I'd certainly like to think so. So whatever your context, whether it's a small team or a limited budget to work with, the fundraiser's challenge is the same. It is about finding creative and strategic routes to derive the maximum results on the resources available. Now, I'm absolutely delighted to have Tom, Lynn and Una exploring this topic with us today. And if I may, I'd love to start by asking each of our panelists in turn to give their perspective, insights and experience around fundraising on limited resources and what advice you'd share in terms of best practice approaches. So if we are happy, why don't we go with the order in which Alex introduced? So why don't we start with Tom?
Hiya, you're right. Hi everyone. So for those of you who don't know, Lighthouse in Poole, where I work, we are a major arts centre down on the south coast. We've got a 1,400 seat symphonic concert hall, a 650 seat theatre, a studio, a couple of art galleries, a cinema. So we have got quite a wide range of stuff there, which is why it was quite surprising at the time when I started about 3.5 years ago to find that fundraising hadn't really been part of the agenda at Lighthouse for quite a while. So when I started there, I came in as fundraising manager. I wasn't taking over from someone. I didn't have a team already there. It was a completely new role. So I went into an organisation and it was made quite clear from the start that there was not much engagement amongst colleagues with fundraising. And as Deborah was just saying there, relying on your colleagues to get behind fundraising, it very quickly became clear to me that that was something we needed to do. And especially some slight historic mistrust of fundraising from work with consultancies in years gone by that hadn't been seen to be that successful, and a sort of wariness and cynicism around the dark arts of fundraising amongst some of my new colleagues. So what I did was straight away was search out where the quick wins were that we could have a big public profile among the team, into the whole staff team, that is, in terms of how fundraising can be successful to get everyone involved. And we did a very rough and ready Christmas appeal. I'd started there in October, so it was quite quick. But it was great because it was an appeal to give free tickets to people who've experienced disadvantage in our community, which is, rather than come in and start trying to tell everyone what we all know about the case for support for the arts in our community, is I just went with the simple, blunt instrument of, this is a real tug at the heartstrings case for support. And it was brilliant because everyone got behind it. It's a time of year that everyone loves. We had our panto on, the panto cast got behind it as well and sort of shouted about the appeal. We had front of house shaking buckets. Our box office staff dipped their toes for the first time ever in the water of point of sale donation asks. Our finance team got really excited by it and were creating spreadsheets and totalizers for us to put up around the building. Everyone got involved, and it was really nice to see. And quite early on, it really helped to get that buy-in of everyone around. And what it also did was it kind of helped me focus on where I was going to put the resources in my first year or 2 years there at Lighthouse. It was quite lucky, really. I had a bit of a long time to get to do it, but it showed me that individual giving really was where I was going to focus, because one of the big things about it did, for an organisation that didn't have many donors from the past, it gave me that initial wealth of data of people who were going to support us. And so we focused on that. We had events, and again, it got everyone in the building involved, and holding events that people are interested in and highlights their own jobs, I've found, is a really good way of getting them to be involved as well. So events we set up a new membership scheme, so events for friends, events for people who'd supported a capital appeal that had been about 5 years previously, but got them back involved. And it was just a really nice way. And I'll wholeheartedly recommend having appeals that everyone can get involved in and events that everyone can get involved in as a way of showing your colleagues what fundraising is about and getting them as excited about it as you are. Rather than kind of, if I'd have come in and just said, this is the case for support, ask the box office team to make point of sale asks without really pushing it, I think it would have been a much more difficult proposition for them. So with that in mind, that's kind of where I was thinking in terms of how I've engaged my colleagues and kind of got the most out of them and on those limited resources. And on the events front, I was also going to briefly talk about, using those resources a bit more strategically. And I think one of the problems every organization is going to have their own sort of issues, but one of for me, the big resource problems that we have is the fact that we are a touring venue, we're a receiving house. So a lot of the work, the majority of the work we present is stuff that's in for a few nights a week. We don't have much ownership over the artists, the creatives, and that makes it quite difficult for us to have that extra level of engagement with donors, which is something I've been used to at other organizations I've worked where we've created the work. So again, nailing down on those parts of the organization that are interested in and we've had things where our head of maintenance has taken people into some of the weird back ends of the building, which doesn't sound exciting, but oh my god, you can't believe how excited donors are by that kind of thing. It really helps you build those relationships quickly with people, and again, it gets people realizing their jobs are as interesting to our supporters and donors as well. So I think those were my key points. For me, we're now in a much stronger place after that first year. We kind of got to a position where individual giving was starting to take off. Then we had a pandemic, which turned out to be an absolute godsend for fundraising. I know it's quite a weird thing to say that, but so many new potential donors came out of the woodwork, but it also made us as an organization refocus where we were and look at kind of the work we produce, which for me as fundraising has now sort of set a whole new course of work to do. And we're expanding away from that line of individual giving to a lot more projects that are great for getting grants in and stuff and building our team. So from there on, it's been a really good journey for us. And for me, my key points on fundraising with limited resources is finding those interesting ways to engage your colleagues, holding nice, easy to do events, because it's a very easy way for you as one person to get everyone to help you, but also to engage with those people pretty quickly. And yeah, make the most out of what everyone in your building does, or in your organization, I should say, not everyone's a building. So yeah, that's my 2 pence worth on how I've done things with limited resources at Lighthouse.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tom. That's brilliant to hear. And I'll spare your blushes, but I will say that, you know, coming into an organization, there's a world where you could have come in and written a strategy in a silo and then imposed it upon your colleagues. But, you know, testament to your approach and your belief in who culture is for, I think. You know, clearly you've gone in and you, as you say yourself in your own words, you've looked for the quick wins, but also you've looked for harnessing energy around a project that everybody can get involved in. And I think that's really key, because when we talk about building a culture of philanthropy, it's absolutely about starting with people first, and celebrating their own skills and expertise, their experience. You know, those people who've worked there for very many years and can tell many a story of the work and the people that have benefited from that work. And you know, the other thing I think that's really interesting is finding ways to engage colleagues where they can actually contribute to fundraising, but they're not necessarily being asked to step outside of their day-to-day work. Actually, you're making fundraising part of their day-to-day work, which again I think is a really brilliant takeaway for all of us to consider when thinking about how we engage our counterparts in fundraising.
Thanks.
So thank you. Lovely. Great. Let's move on to Lynn, please.
Hi again, everyone. Really interesting to hear, Tom, a few years down the line from where I am at the moment, and really encouraging to see where you've got to. From my point of view, the orchestra I work with are quite unusual, because we've been around for 100 years, and we've primarily been supported by individual donations through that time. Most donations over the years have come through the friends of our music director, who's been at the helm for over 30 years. And in some ways, this is wonderful, because you have really strong personal relationships with donors. But what that's also meant is that there's never been a sort of full fundraising strategy in place to look at different sources of income. I started working with the orchestra initially as a freelancer, because things, of course, really changed through COVID, because all those lovely donors couldn't come and watch the orchestra anymore. And they needed to start to look at COVID response funding and to go to the Arts Council, which was the very first time in 100 years they'd even approached the Arts Council or any kind of statutory fundraising. So when I started in the role, it was so unique and different to any other fundraising role that I'd had. And I'd never started somewhere that didn't have any kind of full strategy in place, even if that hadn't actually been adhered to. There had been a development manager, and there's an outreach manager who was sort of having a crack at small fundraising bids. So I didn't have the situation of no one wanting to fundraise. Everyone was sort of having a bit of a go at it as part of their role. But no one really wanted to do it. And they were all very happy that someone could come in, take it over. But it meant that the first few months have been about kind of unpicking things and working out where we are and trying to find a way forward. And probably position maybe a lot of people in when you start a new job, all those things that have been left for you as the new starter that no one wanted to do, like sort out the membership scheme or tidy up the website. And so with a really limited team of basically me in fundraising, it's been a lot of tidying up and then working my way through what are the priorities, what are the areas that we really need to focus on, because if anyone else sort of watching this is on their own, you know what it's like. You can't do everything. You've got to pick, as Tom says, the quick wins, but also the really significant wins. Because what I've found sort of working on my own with this is it's really exciting, and you can make it in your own image, and you can do all the things that perhaps you've wanted to do in larger organizations but not had the chance. But you can't do it all. And so you have to prioritize, and you have to set time aside for clear thinking. You also have to be prepared to say no. And that's what I was really bad at when I first started, because you start a job and you want to please, don't you? And it's, of course I can do that. And of course I can speak to this donor. And of course I can have lunch with someone who gives us £50 a year. And then you realize that actually you've got to start saying, what's the return on investment of all these things? I can't do it all. What can other people in the team do? What I would say is that having a small team means everyone does muck in. It's not always everyone's area, and they don't always feel comfortable talking to donors or funders. And perhaps I'm just really lucky with the people I work with. Having limited resources does make us all really club together. And it means that everyone in the organisation knows the donors and the supporters and the projects, which is hugely helpful compared to large organisations where you can be really siloed as a fundraiser, and people can say, oh, that's the development team, I don't want to deal with it. In a small organisation, we all know everyone, we all understand the projects. That's a lovely position to be in. I don't have to spend lots of time managing people, which I used to have to do. That's wonderful. I can be a fundraiser, not a manager. So I'd say that's a real benefit. And it's really is about looking at those positives. And as I said, really, really prioritising the big wins and not getting too caught up in lots of other business, lots of low-level fundraising that isn't going to pay off. So I'd say that's my kind of overview of where I am 8 months in.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lynn. That's so interesting to hear. And it's fascinating that obviously the organisation you've come into, as you say, has a really strong history of what we would call relationship-based fundraising, but actually it's about taking the organisation to the next level and beginning to broaden out the individuals that you're engaging as supporters. But how wonderful to hear that you've got colleagues who are already used to and have been engaged in making that argument, that case for support. Something I wanted to touch on that I think is so valuable, and it goes back to the point I think you made about sort of having that list of things that were waiting for your arrival. The fact remains, doesn't it, that actually doing that sort of ground preparation work is so important for the longer term, and actually it's really worth investing time, I think, as you say, tidying things up so that you've really got that strong basis to then work from. And the other thing, I think the other really brilliant point you've made is knowing when to say no. I think as fundraisers, we're by our very nature hungry for new work, we're excited by prospects and opportunities, but sometimes you've got to just take a pause, haven't you, and be realistic about actually, is it worth investing time and resource in that? Or, as you say, perhaps it's about focusing on where you can make the more significant leaps in terms of fundraising. So thank you, that was brilliant. Una, let's come to you as our third panelist.
Thanks, Deborah. Great to be here today. I was reflecting on sort of my relationship with fundraising in preparation of today, and what first came to mind was the fact that when I was working as a freelance director and producer, one of my least favorite things to hear was, and I think this will be a sentence that's familiar to us all, is we don't have the budget for that. And when you're making work in or with cultural organizations, the straightening of resources, I think, is something that you feel even before anybody articulates it to you. So it's a really important thing to sort of reflect on how you can meet those artists or the people who are benefiting from your work at that moment. In my case, what it led me to do was to engage head on, I suppose, in the challenge, and to get curious and creative about where the money was going to come from. So that led me to seeking out funding from unusual sources. Whether that was a grant-making organization that had never been approached by an artist before, or businesses who were intrigued to partner on creative projects. And I say this, I suppose, as I reflect on the ways forward through this time of crisis, which is really a crisis of resources, that I think part of the solution, and as the others before me have pointed out, is to do with taking stock of what you have. And one of those resources is people, and not just any kind of people, but really creative people. Cultural organizations, as we know, are full of creative people. Some of the most interesting people I know work in cultural organizations, and not necessarily in leadership or artistic roles. They work in, they're making your coffee, they're taking your coat in the cloakroom, they're managing budgets to make sure that the heating bill gets paid. So I think these people are the secret resource. And if we want to increase our capacity to fundraise, we need to think about creating a culture across an organization where this activity takes place. Because as Lynn pointed out, too often fundraising is siloed, and it's considered something that takes place in one part of the building and nowhere else. I think the first step in doing that and engaging, a whole organization is demystifying what the process entails. And the key to this really, and this is when it's good to have a wealth of creativity at your disposal, is storytelling. And it seems really obvious to say, but in order to be able to communicate the value of something, we need to be able to understand what it is that we're doing, and therefore be able to capture the imagination of the person that we're speaking to. And that's when we start to see a base of prospective donors, or indeed, as you say, to hold on to people who already believe in the work that we're doing. I think in my case, one of the most successful campaigns I've been involved in was for a project that I co-founded called Change of Address. And we were raising money for an artistic and social support program for LGBT asylum seekers. So it was 2015, and it was during one of the peaks of the ongoing refugee crisis, and we were all watching scenes of horror unfold across Europe at borders. Many people felt very helpless about that. But in Ireland, it was also the year that we held a referendum on same-sex marriage. And the country was still basking in the glow of being the first country in the world to legislate for equal marriage by popular vote. So we understood that we could connect to the positive emotions of that successful campaign in order to raise awareness of and ultimately raise money for our work. And that came down to an ability to tell a story. So it was about telling the story, in this instance, of a country, of a nation where that many had left in previous generations, but that country had since had a reckoning with itself and had become more tolerant and more inclusive, and could now be a place where a place of refuge for individuals fleeing persecution from elsewhere. So that was a story that many people connected to. It meant that we reached our target in a very short space of time with that particular campaign, but it also created a profile for the work and a momentum that meant we were able to attract the support of partners and stakeholders who would actually be able to help us bring our work to the next level. So now in my work with the Cultural Philanthropy Foundation, one of the key pieces of our work and our program for this year is a campaign which is around communicating that value. The campaign is called Culture is Creating, and we're advocating for 8 types of value that art and culture creates. Many of us will be very familiar with making that case for support for, the intrinsic value or the economic value, but we're perhaps less practiced at making the case for cultural activity that creates value in, for example, mental health, or build a community, or social benefits. So alongside the Achates Prize, that campaign will be running later this year. And really it's about being able to, I suppose, giving organizations the tools to communicate that value in order to engage with what I suppose we would call impact philanthropy. And just a final note on the prize then, I suppose, is one of the things that I was really struck by when I was reviewing old application forms, and a lot of the time these were for either shortlisted or entries that had won the prize, was the fact that so many of those relationships started with a story being told and someone telling the right story to the right person at the right time, because those stories have the power to connect us to place, to others, to a social justice instinct, and ultimately to the transformative power of art and culture. So I suppose to build on what the others have sort of articulated so brilliantly in their own experience, I suppose my provocation today really, and I'll leave it there for now, is a question about how fundraising can be a co-creative activity. And really to think about who in your organization's community, whether that's within the organization itself or the people that you've been working with or attracted support from, who are you not currently hearing from, and who might be able to tell the story of what you're doing in a way that can engage new supporters and ultimately sustain your work for the future.
Wonderful, thank you, Una, and thank you for your provocation as well. That's a brilliant question to pose, and I'm sure we'll unpick that a little as we get into some of our questions. I really liked what you said when you pointed to the idea of looking at those non-traditional sources, because of course, as I mentioned earlier, never has the landscape been more competitive for funding and for fundraising, and actually thinking creatively about how an organization or a piece of work actually drives some of those other benefits and values that you've talked about, Una. Perhaps that might unlock other sources of income that are not maybe in that sort of the sorts of lists that we often pull together when we think who the arts funders typically are. The other thing I loved was that people are the secret resource. And I do think that probably goes back very much to what both Lynn and Tom were saying about, bringing colleagues along with you and involving them, because there's no doubt about it that, it's those stories and it's that experience and those individuals that are able to do that storytelling. And I think that's, the biggest takeaway for me from what you've shared, Una, is very much about storytelling and being able to articulate the work that you're doing, the impact it's having, who it's reaching, because as you say, you never know where a conversation might take you. So wonderful. Let's jump into some questions, and then I know that we've had a couple of questions coming in as you've all been talking. So in a short while, I shall hand back to Alex, and she can field those to you as well. I wonder if we can start by just thinking, building on the point really about bringing people on board. Bearing in mind that some people do, as Tom says, sort of perceive fundraising as being a dark art, or maybe sort of have cynicism when thinking about fundraising. What would you say, what would your advice be to someone trying to bring their colleagues along with them? Are there any approaches that you might recommend using to empower colleagues to participate in fundraising? Tom, I wonder if I could come to you first on that question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I kind of on the theme of what I was saying earlier, is that I think for me, the way to empower your colleagues is just to show them how exciting their work is. And you're not asking them to make an ask, not asking them to necessarily do the things that they see as scary, but just to put them in front of supporters, audiences, people who might take any sort of interest in your organization, and letting them just be themselves and talk about what they're doing and showing them the importance of what they do as well. I think, I mean, goes back to, what, people have said before in terms of, the finance people in the finance team worrying about kind of how to pay certain bills and keep the lights running. Well, actually, our head of finance is a really interesting guy, and him and his colleagues, when they talk about some of that stuff that we think is kind of humdrum, again, it's quite interesting to people who aren't involved. And I think kind of showing your colleagues that what they do is interesting to people outside your organization is a great way of helping them get them involved and bringing everyone together, and knowing we're all kind of following the same course, and anything that's good for me as the fundraiser is good for them, is good for everyone. So.
Brilliant, thank you, Tom. That's fantastic. I'm going to just move us on a little bit to a point that Lynn was making earlier. That point about sort of getting your ducks in a row, making sure that you've got the sort of the ground work in place in order to work from. Lynn, I wonder if you might have some thoughts on, in your experience, what the sort of most effective systems or approaches might be to managing competing fundraising priorities.
Oh, that's a question I probably grapple with every day, especially in a small team, because, and actually this can be in a large team or a small team, because it's so easy to just get bogged down with emails, meetings. And I'm sure we're all there, and they're quicker wins, aren't they? Oh, I can cross this off the list because I can email that person, or I can be in a Zoom meeting for 2 hours, which was only meant to be for 1 hour, but we're having a nice chat now. So you've got to be quite strict with yourself, I think. And that's really hard, because doing things like writing the bids or the strategy is always the hardest thing to sit down and do when there's kind of more fun stuff. So I think that you have to stop and take the time to think. And I actually block off time, and I turn off the emails, and I don't answer the phone, and I'm quite strict about that, because I actually felt bad if I'd had a day when I hadn't actually spent time doing that and planning it. I felt a little like the day I'd lost control of the day. And you can be very busy but not actually achieving very much. So I do think it's about being quite strict. You can't always adhere to a paper strategy because life changes, and actually that's one of the joys of working in our industry, that there's lovely new opportunities to create new events and concerts and productions and art and fantastic new partners. But I think that if you have a calm confidence that you know where you're going and what you're doing, it's actually easier then to slot things in when opportunities present themselves, or there's a new funding stream that's opened and you think, you know what, I think maybe I can add this into the mix and it will work with one of our projects. But I think that unless you have that calm and that sense that you've got a structure and you know where you're going with it, it can all feel quite panicked, and it's very hard to decide what those key priorities should be. But with clear objectives, a clear idea what your target is, a clear idea about what you have capacity for, you can more easily say, I don't think we're going to be able to do that now, but in 6 months' time or in 12 months' time, let's work towards that. But I think you need to allow yourself the time to decide this is the way forward. Otherwise, you're kind of working in a whirlwind of panic all the time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that point about structure and boundaries and having a sense of control and not being closed off to, as you say, Lynn, opportunities that might come across your desk, but also giving yourself the space to be able to do work in a logical order. That makes perfect sense to me. Una, I wonder if I could come to you next and ask, for an organisation or a project where fundraising is required, what would you say are the key factors to consider when determining where to focus your energy when you've got lean resources to work with?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I suppose, you know, as you say, there's the kind of obvious places that people usually have a list of in their head, and they're going, okay, we can go for this grant, we can approach this foundation, or people that they've had relationships with before, and often there isn't the time to do everything that you want to do. So I think it is about being strategic and saying, I think Lynn said this maybe beforehand, you know, you can't keep just chasing small pots. And really looking at what those bigger wins might be if you just put in a little bit more time with it. I would also say, you know, thinking beyond cash, in the sense of maybe even strategic partnerships, so in-kind partnerships, what kind of organizations can you work alongside and share resources with? And then that funnels down as well, I think, to individual donors. So, you know, I think one of the reasons that we have an historic resistance or reluctance to asking for support is because we're funny about money. And one of the ways that I've seen that turn around and actually create, you know, some really kind of big opportunities in the past is thinking about approaching people for something other than money. So if somebody is interested and engaged with you, how can you have a conversation that's not about filling a gap in your budget? I've seen that work really well with, you know, asking people to come in and do workshops or talks. It's something that they get to actually engage with their passion. Also being able to meet with the beneficiaries. I'm thinking in a particular instance when I was working with a charity that worked with care leaving young people, you know, people just wanted to be with the young people and to do that work, and actually focusing on those relationships again meant that they were more likely to give money in the long term. But it's starting from a place of mutual like a reciprocity, I suppose, that isn't just about, can you help us to, you know, to get through the next 6 months.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you, Una. I'm going to ask one more question before I hand back to Alex. And the question is, what role do you think data and other institutional intelligence can play in underpinning a strategic approach to fundraising? Tom, can I press you on that question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for me, I think looking at when you're setting targets and discussing your resources and what you can do, looking at the wider data that's out there within the sector is really important for benchmarking. For me, the data with the organisation I work in, one of the big pieces of data we have is our audiences. Having some organisations don't have as much data on their supporters and audiences as we do, so that's quite lucky, and it is why, again, individual giving can be such a focus in our strategy and what we do. For me, when I first started, I don't know if people know Poole, the area where we're in. It's quite a strange area in that where Lighthouse is quite a deprived town centre, but just down the road we've got some of the most expensive houses in the country down at Sandbanks, where I was immediately told, oh, you must get down to Sandbanks where there's millionaires everywhere. And the fact is, hardly any of those people had ever been to Lighthouse in their life. And it was using the data that we had internally was massively important in pulling together those pipelines and showing my colleagues that that's not where I'm going to be focusing my attention. I'm not going to be going to sit down at the expensive beach clubs down there to try and meet people who just aren't going to be interested in what we're doing. So yeah, on that subject, I think utilizing the data that you've got on people who know your organization is the most important starting point for me.
Great, thank you, Tom. Yeah, I think probably most fundraisers have got their own similar story to tell of a colleague or a board member suggesting insert name of philanthropist here. But yeah, you raise a really good point. It is about that data-led approach and actually who's already engaging with the work, and therefore who might be the most receptive to having that further conversation about engaging in a philanthropic relationship. I feel like I could continue this conversation all afternoon, but I mustn't. I must hand back to Alex so that she can field some questions for the floor. But thank you, Una, Lynn and Tom. That's been a really refreshing conversation to have, and it sounds like we've got some brilliant people in the profession who've got very sensible heads on their shoulders and are very clear about where they need to focus their attention. So back to you, Alex.
Thank you, Deborah. A huge thank you again to our fantastic panel for a great discussion. Lots of insights there that I know everyone will find really helpful. So as mentioned, we've had some really great questions through. So I'm going to kick straight off. Something that we've not touched on yet, and interested to hear the panel's views. So the question is, do you have any experience of corporate fundraising within a small organisation or with limited resources? And what would you advise when it comes to approaching this? So I wonder, perhaps, Lynn, if we could start with you on that.
Yeah, when I first started fundraising a long time ago, and perhaps I was just quite lucky, but corporate sponsorship seemed to be quite easy and they didn't seem to ask for an awful lot. So sort of 20 years ago, I could get a play sponsored or a season sponsored, and a bank or a accountancy firm or consultancy firm would give you the money, and they'd just want to come and drink some warm white wine, and in a very sexist way saying it's something for the wives. Thank God we've sort of moved on from this now. But what I have found is that quite rightly, it's a much more robust process securing sponsorship, and it's something that for quite some time I actually put on the back burner, because it got to the point where the amount of money that certainly in the provinces I could secure for sponsorship of whether it's a concert or a play was actually probably not worth the amount of effort and the amount of corporate hospitality and free tickets that I had to offer. What I found in my current role is that because we're really starting at the orchestra from like a real, from very, very low levels of fundraising, and with it, as I said, all being very much about individual donations, that I have very much sort of followed the line that Una was talking about, and that's about partnerships. So I have started to talk to a major hotel chain who've come on board because the hotel is right next to the concert hall where we perform in London. There's no money, it's a contra deal. I'm working with a drinks company to provide wine for exactly the same reason. I'm not looking for cash at the moment. It's very much about building relationships with brands that fit our ethos, that will be interesting to our patrons, where hopefully we as an organisation can also give something back to them. And whether that's free tickets, something for their guests, just being part of a community that can cross-promote, have shared PR opportunities. And again, being careful about how much time we spend on it, because it's budget relieving rather than pure cash. But I also hope it's starting to build this sense that we have interesting partners that will in turn bring fresh money into the organisation. So I do think it's valuable, but certainly for London Chamber Orchestra, it's not something that's bringing in large amounts of cash at the moment, but I wouldn't discount it if it's something that people out there are thinking of.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Lynn. I wonder, Una, if I can turn to you, because you very briefly sort of cited your work with change of address and pitching to corporate organisations that might not have expected to be working with creative projects in this way. Can you perhaps give us a bit of a sense of your experience in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it comes down to, I suppose, you're seeking out prospective donors who might connect to the story. So it was a personal connection that I was able to kind of ask somebody to make the introduction, and then really to engage with them because, this was a story about, this was a project about immigration, and this person, was from an immigrant background. So within sort of 5 minutes, it was saying, look, here's something that has the potential to really transform people's lives, so that they can, go on to be as successful as you are. It does come down to that. I mean, these things sound so obvious when you kind of describe them, but actually I think in that instance, rather than saying, oh wow, here's somebody who has, a persona, in this case, a persona related to a particular company, actually it was about connecting to who they are, on a personal level. Not going to work every time, but obviously did in this instance. And I think there is a real appetite for that at the moment, in a good way. I think, we're looking at ways of talking to people about wealth, and about their potential to make change within culture in a way that's far more progressive than I think it was, 2 or 3 years ago. So I think that's a really exciting way for people to be able to think.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Tom, can you give us a perspective from a venue? Because of course you're the only person on the panel who's operating in that context. So it'd be interesting to hear from you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, on the topic of resource, when we're talking about corporates, I do feel that corporate fundraising can be the most resource heavy area of fundraising, which is why, to be honest, at Lighthouse, like Lynn was saying as well, I've not really put a lot of focus on it. We've got a few corporate partners who've come out of personal relationships, and as Una was saying, it comes about those people, and that's why it can be really hard, corporate fundraising, because you can develop relationships with people, and people change jobs, people move on. And when I worked in previous jobs, when I worked at Northern Ballet, I focused purely on corporate fundraising, and it's getting harder in the current climate. Certainly company, I know charities and arts organizations that do it well. The Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra, who are big partners of us, they're based at Lighthouse. They've got a huge corporate partnership portfolio, but they've got a team of 3 people dedicated to it, and as far as I know, there's quite a few anyway. And to do it well, I think if you do corporate fundraising piecemeal, you're not going to be successful. If you start contacting a lot of companies with your offer, you need to have the resources ready to respond to anyone who shows an interest. And I'm not saying that corporate fundraising isn't a really important tool, but if you're worried about resources, my feeling is that kind of comes last after building relationships with individuals who are going to support you and going for those, the bigger trusts and grant applications, as Una was referring to earlier as well.
That's helpful. It's interesting. I think we're all in this same position of identifying that corporate income has to be worth the input and approaching it in a slightly different way, certainly to 10 years ago and definitely from 20 years ago, as Lynn cited. We might have time for one final question. This is something I'm sure that we've all grappled with in our different cultural environments. So there's a tension between donors wanting a very specific ask and organisations wanting much needed unrestricted funds. So how are you addressing that issue, particularly operating within a team on limited resource? So perhaps Una, let's come to you first on that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I think I mentioned at the end of my first contribution the idea of impact philanthropy. So again, I feel like I mean, you do see instances of it. I'm always sort of waiting for it to take off a little bit more. So I think that's one way of thinking about it being a specific ask, but actually leading to essentially unrestricted funding, sort of saying, look, you know, in the case of an individual, X amount is going to allow us to unlock this project, or for, you know, in the case of if you're working with particular beneficiaries, that this person will be able to engage with our work. So I think that's one way of thinking about it, that there's a specificity, but ultimately you're not tied into a particular project and sort of spreading yourself really thinly across various different sort of focuses. That's really great. Lynn, do you want to add a final word on that?
Yeah, it's the hardest thing, and obviously big charities have come under a lot of criticism in recent years for, you know, people perceiving that their giving is going to administration. Of course, we know working in the sector, you need the administration. I think as fundraisers, it goes back to like this storytelling idea. You want to talk about the projects and the people that are going to be impacted by their gift. So inevitably, you are going to talk about project focused giving rather than core fundraising. If you are a commercial, if you have a commercial part of your organisation, whether that's through selling tickets or through sort of other areas of work, you ideally are going to be funding the salaries and all the kind of boring stuff through that, so that any donations are directly going to make those projects happen. But it is difficult, and if you're really lucky, you can find donors where you can have that really honest conversation. And certainly I think funders, charitable trusts and foundations are actually getting more open to accepting a bit more of that full cost recovery model, more so than I think that they used to. But it's always a challenge to put in those core costs, because no one kind of wants to fund the toilets being cleaned, but we all sort of need that. So it's an ongoing issue for all of us, I think, we're grappling with.
Yeah, so we don't end on the toilets being cleaned as our final image. Tom, do you want to just come in with a short final closing thought on that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lovely way to end the chat, but I
refined.
I think for me as well, it's about having a really good relationship with your finance team and knowing what's in the budget, and when you're planning for things coming forward, knowing, well, actually specific donors are interested in certain things. So if you make certain projects part of the core budget, then it immediately becomes, it's not unrestricted income, but it's budget relieving at that point. So I think it's just about knowing the people who are going to support you quite well, and knowing that actually so and so is really interested in this. It's not necessarily a project that was a priority, but it's something that we could do and it could tick certain boxes. So I think, yeah, kind of having a good knowledge of what your supporters might want to support and what things are similar to what they want to support that are in the planning and pipeline as well, so that you could steer them in the direction of things that we're not planning on doing X, but Y is quite similar. Do you want to get involved with that? So.
That's great. Thank you for that. I'm conscious of time, so I think we should probably wind up today's conversation. I'd like to thank our panelists, of course, Tom, Lynn and Una, and Deborah for chairing today. As you know, here at Achates, we offer a range of services, including recruitment, fundraising, strategy and organisational development. So if you're interested in discussing how we might be able to support you, or if you'd like to speak to a member of the team, please drop us a line at info@achates.org.uk. Also, a couple of reminders that next Thursday at 11 a.m. we'll be hosting a webinar on National Lottery project grants, an email reminder for which should be hitting your inboxes tomorrow. So look out for that and please sign up. You might also have spotted that entries are now open for the 6th Achates Philanthropy Prize, which asks cultural organisations to celebrate and nominate examples of first-time philanthropy. We're posting a link to further information in the chat, I believe. So head over, take a look at that, and we'd absolutely love to receive your nominations. So finally, just to note that we're taking a break over the summer, which means that our next Achates Live event will be on Thursday, the 8th of September, 2022, and there'll be more details to follow soon, so keep an eye on your inboxes for that. It just remains for me to say thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you back with us again in the autumn. Bye for now.